Welcome to episode 133 of OTD, your daily dose of soccer history by 17 Lost Guy. It's March 13, 1909, and today's story is about a trophy-winning national team that no longer exists. Not a youth side, not a B team, not an Olympic side in the modern sense, but a national team. Because on this day in 1909, England's amateur 11 beat Germany 9-0 in Oxford. England's amateur national team had represented Great Britain and won Olympic gold only a few months earlier in London. Now it was dismantling Germany by 9, and all of it belonged to a brief era when England's amateur representatives could hand out absurd defeats to countries that would later grow into major football nations. But how did we get here? The first thing to understand is that early international football was not yet cleanly standardized. The idea that every country had one obvious, singular senior national team is something we tend to project backwards. But the early 20th century was much messier than that. England had its full national team, of course, but the growth of professionalism created a second problem. What do you do with elite amateurs, especially when amateurism still carries moral prestige and institutional power? The answer was the England amateur team. It emerged formally in the early 20th century, in part because the professional game had grown so strong that amateurs could no longer reliably find places in the main England side, and that matters. This was not a weak afterthought. This was a representative side created because there was enough high-level amateur talent, enough institutional will, and enough cultural prestige to justify a parallel national team. This was also the age in which amateurism still had its grand self-image, as we touched upon just a few days ago in episode 129 about the last Sheriff of London shield. It thought of itself as purer, cleaner, less compromised by money, and nowhere was that self-image more powerful than in Olympic football. The Olympics were still an amateur preserve, so the England amateur side effectively became the footballing face of Britain there. That is why this team mattered so much beyond England itself. And by 1908, it was not just respectable, it was formidable. At the London Olympics in October 1908, Great Britain, in practical terms an FA-run side, drawn from England's amateurs, won the gold medal. They beat Sweden 12-1, the Netherlands 4-0, and Denmark 2-0 in the final. Vivian Woodward captained the side in that final and scored one of the goals. It was not only victory, it was authority. That Olympic success matters for this story because the team that faced Germany in March 1909, less than 6 months after winning Olympic gold, looked very much like its continuation. Many of the same players were there: Horace Bailey, Frederick Chapman, Waddy Corbett, Arthur Berry, Robert Hawkes, Kenneth Hunt, and Herbert Smith. And then there were the changes. Most notably, Vivian Woodward was absent. Into that space stepped fresh names, including Cyril Dunning, whose England amateur career would burn brilliantly and briefly. And Dunning really is one of the great little characters in this story. He was a Norwich player, unusually an amateur playing for a professional club, and when he entered the England amateur picture in 1909, he didn't ease his way in gently. He exploded. On debut against Germany, he scored 3. Within weeks, he would score again and again. A 4-goal haul against Belgium, 2 against the Netherlands, 2 against Switzerland. In 4 official matches for England amateurs in 1909, he scored 11 goals. That is not just prolific, that's absurd. It comes out at 2.75 goals per match. And then, that was it. Dunning didn't play in any other international for England. That's wild. Think about that in the context of 2026. Can you imagine a player scoring this much only to not being called up again? But that's so important to understand that by March 1909, England's amateur 11 represented something larger than a team sheet. It represented an entire football order, one where the old amateur ideal still possessed real force, one where Olympic prestige mattered, one where England believed it could send out educated, tactically sound, technically superior gentlemen and schoolmasters and architects and clerks and win heavily almost anywhere. And then came Germany. Now, Germany in 1909 was still at the beginning. The German Football Association had only been founded in 1900, as we talked about in OTD episode 89. The senior national team had played its first official international in 1908, so this was a young football nation, still learning, still organizing, still absorbing. England were meeting not as a Finnish power, but a country still being introduced to the highest representative level of the game. And that match was played on this day in 1909 at the White House ground in Oxford, in front of a crowd of around 6,000. And England were in front after 7 minutes. Cyril Dunning, on his debut, made it 1-0. 7 minutes later, he scored again. And by the 22nd minute, Thomas Porter had made it 3-0. Frederick Chapman added the fourth, and Gordon Hoare scored the fifth before halftime. 5-0 at the break. At that point, the match was already gone. But what makes it memorable is that England kept scoring without it ever feeling like a single-player carnival. Yes, Dunning got his hat-trick, but Porter scored 3 as well. Hoare got 2, and Chapman got 1. The goals were shared out across the forward line, which tells you something about the collective quality. Final score, 9-0. And that result still sits in the records. To this day, it remains Germany's record international defeat. That is the kind of fact that startles modern ears, because modern Germany feels almost too grand for such a beginning. But football history is full of these reversals. The future power often begins as a student. There are other striking details too. This England side included debutants. It was not even a fully fixed all-star side. It was both strong and renewable. And that is part of what made England's amateurs so influential and so dangerous in this period. They were not merely one golden generation. They were the product of a system. And that system kept producing these emphatic scorelines. France lost 15-0 to England amateurs in 1906. The Netherlands lost 12-2 in 1907. Germany, as we just spoke about, lost 9-0 in 1909. Belgium lost 11-2 a month later. And in 1912, as Great Britain at the Olympics, Sweden lost 12-2 and Hungary 7-0. Even today, the England amateur side remains attached to several nations' record defeats. That is an astonishing legacy for a team that no longer exists. So what does it all mean? It tells us that England's amateur internationals were part of football's early global infrastructure. They were not just playing exhibitions, they were carrying the game, sometimes literally introducing tactical ideas, sometimes demonstrating standards of passing and positioning, and sometimes showing what an organized representative side could look like. The scorelines could feel brutal, even patronizing, and they were. But they were also part of the process by which other countries learned, adapted, and then eventually surpassed. And that's the real irony here. England's amateurs helped teach football abroad, and the pupils got very, very good. Germany is the obvious example in today's episode. From 9-0 down in Oxford in 1909 to world champions in 1954, 74, 90, and 2014. From raw beginners to one of the sport's great systems. And Germany are not alone. The same broad story applies across much of continental Europe. The early defeats were not endpoints. They were opening chapters. Also, this match sits at a hinge moment in football's Clas history. The amateur team still looked magnificent in 1909. It would defend Olympic gold in 1912. But by 1920, when Great Britain were knocked out in the first round of the Olympic tournament, the old certainty was already wobbling. Others had improved, the gap had narrowed, and the export business had started creating competitors. And then the 20th century kept moving. Professionalism, once resisted, became normal. Continental club football grew stronger. National associations matured. International coaching improved. The World Cup arrived. And European club and national competitions took shape and then hardened into the structures we now take for granted in the 1950s and 1960s. The old amateur versus professional divide did not disappear overnight, but the direction of travel was obvious. That is also why the Olympics became such a strange last refuge for amateurism. For decades, Olympic football still operated under amateur restrictions, even as the real world no longer did. And that opened the door to one of the great hypocrisies of 20th century sport, the era of the so-called state amateur. That is a story we have touched on before in this podcast, especially in the episodes on the Eastern European dominance of Olympic football between 1956 and 1980. Those teams were amateur largely on paper. The vocabulary survived, after the reality had changed. By then, England's old amateur world was already fading, and in 1974, the line was finally removed by the FA. The official distinction between amateur and professional footballers was abolished. That decision ended the England amateur team, ended the old amateur cup world as it has existed, and brought the curtain down on a structure that had once felt central to the sport's identity. So when we talk about England amateurs today, we are talking about more than an old side with a curious scoreline. We're talking about a vanished football civilization, a team that won Olympic gold, a team that represented a class idea, a team that helped carry football beyond England, and a team that inflicted ridiculous defeats on nations that later wrote much larger football histories than England's amateur gentlemen ever could have imagined. So before we go, 3 things to take away from March 13, 1909. First, England's amateur 11 was not a novelty act. For a time, it was one of the most important representative sides in world football. Second, the 9-0 against Germany sounds absurd now only because we know what Germany later became. In 1909, it was still one of the countries learning the game that England was exporting. And third, this result belongs to the bigger story of football's transition from the age of amateur prestige to the age of professional modernity. And once that transition was complete, teams like England amateurs no longer made sense. On this day in 1909, England's amateur 11 beat Germany 9-0 in Oxford, with debutant Cyril Dunning scoring a hat-trick, a result that captured both the extraordinary strength of England's amateur football culture and the moment when the game was still being taught, exported, and transformed across Europe. That's all for episode 133 of OTD, your daily dose of soccer history by 17 Lost Guy. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow the show, leave a rating, and share it with a fellow football historian. Tomorrow, we go to March 14, 1948, Vasco da Gama, and a South American title, won before the Copa Libertadores even existed, a continental triumph that belongs in the prehistory of intercontinental club football, and well before Wolves against Honved helped light the fuse for Europe's own premier competition. See you tomorrow.